be like or whether or not you have PBS. So these days it's nice to know when I come home to Los Angeles, I can watch KLCS, the only PBS station still broadcasting from Los Angeles. With KLCS, I can enjoy great programming that is both entertaining and informative. It's the second largest PBS station in the country and one of only 7 licensed to a school district. But the LAUSD is facing a budget crisis unlike any other in its history, and because of that, this station is in jeopardy. We can lose it all of the award-winning shows, all 3 digital channels of educational programming, it all could go away. Unlike other PBS stations, KLCS has never asked for support from its viewers before, but now they must. 1 out of every 10 homes in Los Angeles watches this station every week, and you're one of them. Please go to klcs.org and choose the level of support that works for you. It's easy and it's tax deductible. They don't need much, but they do need you. Support KLCS. Thank you.
Next time on Masterpiece Classic.
I do not think that is a wise move.
Value your position here, and you shall alter the way you speak to me.
We have to keep moving forward, keep evolving. Tollgate Street Traders. Competitively priced, tradition and quality.
I need you to know that you are my inspiration. You must stop this. You cannot have everything your way.
Next time on Masterpiece Classic.
Up next on KLCS.
Christmas is a magical season of love and celebration.
Christmas wasn't about receiving, it was more about giving and making things yourself.
We used to sing Christmas carols around the tree.
You've got your friends and family, and then you're bringing in the food and you're bringing in the music.
It's magic, really.
If you have your children and they have their health, you're the richest person in the world.
Going through the memories is just beautiful.
Heirloom Meals Christmas Special, a show about treasured family recipes, stories, and tips.
When you get hit in the face, and it's when you get knocked down, it has a lot to do with your ability to get back up and keep going forward.
On this episode of Between the Lines, renowned and award-winning actor Stacy Keach. With his memoir, All in All, Stacy opens up about his struggles and victories on and off the stage and screen, and gives insight not only into his own life, but to the common issues that we all face.
Wednesday at 9.
The first thing that comes to my mind when I think about technology in the classroom is a leveling of the playing field for all kids. And that's really what it does. It allows every child to start where they are and progress as far as they can go. It levels the playing field in the area of the modalities that the child uses to learn. Visual, auditory, kinesthetic. It just really helps every child reach his or her potential.
This is KLCS TV, Los Angeles.
We didn't really know where they were going to take us.
They kicked us all out. Then they burned the churches, burned the buildings. It was terrible.
American citizens were starving, were dying.
The story was never told. It was purposely held secret.
What happened here on our own continent is a tragedy. If this was known, the American people would be appalled.
This program was funded in part by the Aleutian Pribilofs Islands Restitution Trust, the Rasmussen Foundation, the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation, and by
Atak Pristina Wokalan Ala Pristina Muluk, East Landing Pristina. This place is called East Landing, and this is one of the docks used during the evacuation of the Aleuts people to Thunder Bay. They were told to take one bag and get ready to leave the island.
The Aleuts of Alaska would experience war as few other Americans. The only campaign of World War II fought on American soil. The battle for the Aleutians would extract a heavy toll. But in the end, it would not be invading Japanese forces who posed the greatest threat to the Aleuts' survival. That would come from the country Aleuts pledged allegiance to, the United States of America.
The government owned us, and they treated us as property. People learned that they weren't being treated as full citizens.
Aleuts would be sent to isolated internment camps. There they would find pain and grief, and strangely enough, possibility.
The story was never told, and it was such a big story. It's just like it was purposely held secret, and nobody should know this, because I think it's a big black mark on the United States government. I know there are some elders here. They refuse to utter a word about it. They'll just say no. I won't talk about it. And that's the saddest part. I think if we could all get together and talk about it, like we all got together and went through it, I think we'd all be a lot less burdened. It needs to be told. And I think it will now.
Ako na amanas land inirecham nali amat. The story has been passed down through many years.
Ancestors of modern Aleuts, migrants from Asia, settled along this sweeping arc of volcanic islands.
It happened to be a clear day, and they saw the islands on the horizon.
The Aleutian chain separates the Pacific Ocean from the Bering Sea, stretching 1,300 miles west from the Alaskan Peninsula to the international dateline. Here, on the edge of tomorrow, Aleuts have lived for 9,000 years. "200 miles north are the Pribilof Islands. St. Paul and St. George are home to the world's largest Aleut population. Most written histories say Aleuts first came to these islands as slaves of Russian fur traders, but Aleuts tell the story differently.
There was a man named Igadaga who lived in a village on the Aleutian chain, and he was out paddling his single-hatched ikya, or kayak, and he was washed away in a storm. And he lived to tell the tale of coming to a land where there were fur seals and sea otters and abundant bird life. And he told his people that he had been to a place that he calls Tanakh Amik, land of mother's brother, and that anyone that ever goes to Tanakh Amik would always carry a longing to return.
The United States bought Alaska from Russia's Tsar in 1867. The Department of Interior, headquartered more than 4,000 miles away in Washington, D.C., assumed charge of the Aleuts, as it had other Native Americans.
In many regards, it was the same paternalistic setup that other Indian groups in the United States experienced. But it was unique in that the government wanted land from American Indians, but in the case of the Pribilofs, they wanted and needed the Aleuts' labor.
Under the terms of the treaty, Aleuts were United States citizens, but for decades to come, virtually every aspect of Aleut life was subjected to federal scrutiny and control.
We bought Alaska right after the end of the Civil War and after we emancipated the slaves, while we continued a system of enslavement in these remote islands.
Greed and racism in 19th century America are handmaidens to one another. They march in lockstep. They are married. Slavery was profitable. If slavery hadn't been profitable, slavery would have disappeared in the 1830s. It might even have disappeared in the 1780s. The legacy of that lasts into Reconstruction after the Civil War. Blacks are cheap labor. Indians aren't even mattering. Anybody who came into the Aleutian Islands, to the Pribilof Islands, hoped for maximum profitability. One piece of that formula was to employ the local people on the cheapest possible terms.
Federal officials, under pressure to justify the purchase of Alaska, wanted to maximize income. Commercial sealing was an obvious source of revenue, and Aleuts the obvious source of labor. Many in government believed that to profit from one, you had to control the other.
To subdue a people, to render them submissive, you degrade them. That's part of any colonial system. And one of the ways they degraded the Aleuts was by segregating them and humiliating them. The agents, for example, issued orders what time they were to go to bed. They controlled the choice of marriage partners. There was a recreation hall, but only the whites were allowed to use it. They were treated like dogs. And though there were some protests, nobody heard them in those years.
Well into the 20th century, Aleuts would remain unheard and unseen. Then World War II found Alaska, and the Aleuts' lives, already a study in oppression, took an ugly turn.
I was born and raised on St. Paul Island. We had a boat that comes 4 times a year that brings the mail. There was no radios hardly and no TV, nothing like that. And I started school when I was 7 years old. And the one thing that I really learned in English was I pledged allegiance to the flag of America. One day I told my dad what I learned in school, and he was so proud of me. He said, "We're part of the United States, you know. I'm glad you learned that." And so from then on, I used to be proud to be an American, you know, not just an Aleut. We celebrate 4th of July. They dress us up in nice Sunday dresses, and my mom and dad ordered a flag. So we hold a little flag and just go around town and have picnics and lemonade. We didn't know the outside life too much. The Fish and Wildlife was the one that ran the island. There was an agent, and he has an assistant, and there was a storekeeper. There was a doctor. think there were about 7 or 8 employees. Oh, they had all the power they could. We couldn't go over them. If you do, you're punished for that. As we were growing up, I got married to a local boy there, and we had a wonderful life together. And he was a baseball player, so I used to look forward to that Sunday afternoon baseball game. It happened one Sunday afternoon. I was home staying with my children, and my husband was playing ball. And then he came running in and said, they stopped the ball game. They come to evacuate us people.
The evacuation of nearby St. George Island began that same Sunday in June 1942.
And we just got home from church. We had a priest there. His name was Father Fiodosi. And my father was a reader in the church, so we all went to church and came home and had some hot biscuits and coffee and so on. And somebody came to our door and said, we have to get ready because we will be taken off the island very soon.
Having received orders from the Navy to prepare for immediate evacuation, the entire village has been mined with TNT, the cattle rounded up and stanchioned and then shot, pails of gasoline stationed in each house to facilitate destruction.
We were allowed to take 1 bag apiece and clothing on our backs, and that was the way we were to get on the ship.
A total of 19 Fish and Wildlife Service employees and 478 Aleuts were herded aboard the U.S. Army transport Delaroff.
We don't know where we're going, but we left the island.
Nobody, not even the federal officials in charge, knew where they were going. Ordered to follow a devious course, the Delaroff began to zigzag its way south. The evacuation had begun suddenly, but not without warning. Unidentified planes had been buzzing the islands for months, and U.S. Army intelligence had repeatedly warned Japanese imperial forces were preparing to invade Alaska, America's northern frontier.
People scared of hearing the planes. Nighttime you could hear those planes. People, sometimes they hear the planes, they knock on the doors, you know, like outside. Hey, turn your lamps off, turn your lamps off. Everybody was scared. They blacked out, everybody. They don't want to see the lights down the village.
The world was at war, and a new enemy close at hand. The Alaskan Defense Command had been created under the control of General Simon Bolivar Buckner. More than 5,000 soldiers were ordered to garrison a heavily fortified post at Dutch Harbor, near the Aleutian village of Onalaska.
There were dugouts and foxholes being dug everywhere. The sirens, when they went off, we had to move. We had to move to our designated areas, and everyone had a designated area. And our family happened to be down by the town creek, and we were in a large dugout on the side of the riverbank. I remember my mother always brought holy water and holy bread with us, because I guess each time you never knew if it was the real thing. I remember one particular morning, it was a bright sunny day, and I woke up and looked out of the big hole, the entranceway, and across the creek, all the military men, all of a sudden they were there. It seemed to me like overnight.
When Pearl Harbor was bombed in December 1941, Buckner ordered the evacuation of all white women and children from Unalaska. Even the prostitutes were told to go, allowing the Navy to take over a brothel for storage space. But there was no agreement on whether to remove the Aleuts, American citizens all, from harm's way.
These decisions must be made by military authorities. The sooner the
Aleuts
better.
would be safer placed upon other islands in
These people could never adjust themselves to life
Request
outside
authority
their
to evacuate all natives
Federal
of
and Alaska territorial officials seemed incapable of reaching a decision, their arguments clouded by paternalism, prejudice, and political jealousies.
Their immoral nature makes them a menace to soldiers and other workers at the base.
Try to teach them safety, but of course they have primitive tendencies and forget. Some of our Alaska natives are in for serious
I would like to clean out the entire town.
In my mind, we were just nuisance, okay, as far as the government was concerned. Yes, it was time of war, but we were citizens of the United States.
Around the world, GIs were fighting a desperate war against fascism. But at home, America still placed race above individual rights.
The treatment we got was not right. And I don't think anybody else should go through what we did.
Shortly after midnight on June 2nd, 1942, air raid sirens shattered the peace. Japanese aircraft carriers and bombers had been sent to attack Dutch Harbor with the aim of diverting U.S. forces from the naval battle of Midway, 2,000 miles to the south.
Everything went so fast. We had to get to the bomb shelter, and so many people scared. It was just unbelievable.
The airstrike set in motion a full-scale 15-month battle, second only to Iwo Jima for bloody hand-to-hand combat. Unopposed Japanese troops seized the islands of Kiska and Attu, 850 miles west of Dutch Harbor. On Kiska, 10 U.S. weather crew were captured. On Attu, a white radio operator was killed, and 42 Aleuts and a white schoolteacher were taken prisoners.
Well, it's sad because we couldn't do nothing about it. The chief of Act 2 who told the Coast Guard the Japanese will be here. That was Mike Hudikoff. They didn't listen to him.
Hudikoff would die in Japanese POW camp in 1945. 16 other Attuans perished along with him. Incredibly, even as enemy forces became more entrenched, officials continued bickering over whether to evacuate the Aleuts. Finally, Navy Admiral Charles Freeman made a command decision, ordering the immediate evacuation of all natives from the Aleutian Islands.
It was an unhappy story of the government bungling something, and I think they were trying to do the right thing. They were trying to protect people, but they didn't have the wherewithal to do it very well, and they managed it miserably, and it had terrible costs for a great many of the Aleuts.
We were evacuated out of here. My father couldn't go because he was white.
Aleuts had intermarried with Caucasians for nearly 2 centuries, but officials adopted a blood quantum rule. Anyone of 1/8 or more native blood was compelled to ship out immediately.
My father was from Manchester, England, and he was in the Navy, and he got stationed up in Alaska, and he was stationed in St. Paul. That's where he met my mother, and they got married, and they moved to Alaska. We had a big family, and we always had extra people for dinner, people visiting us. We always had a house full.
Our family was never again together. Never again. So when we left here, when we were evacuated from here, we never got together again. So
I think that the context that explains the Aleut episode after the invasion of the Japanese and the bombing of Dutch Harbor I think what explains all of that is racism. It's a blatant racism, and by blatant I mean it's a racism that no one feels they need apologize for. And that reflects where American culture was in the 1940s and still into the 1950s.
Like Americans of Japanese descent, Aleuts would find themselves shunted into government camps. Suspected of nothing, accused of nothing, Aleuts never imagined they too would be segregated, isolated in American gulags. Dark, dank camps, mired in the coastal muck of southeast Alaska's dense, intemperate rainforests.
One of the problems was that they weren't really respected as individuals. What this country stands for very much is personal dealing between the government and the citizens. That was one of the things that had gone off the rails in a very profound and important way in the beginning of the Second World War. And given the terrible conditions in which people were placed, it puts a heavier weight on the government shoulders.
Everybody on board from Unalaska was at the railing, you know, just saying goodbye to home and hoping to be back soon. And my father had come out, and my mother had held me up to the railing so I could say goodbye. And I was dressed in my Sunday school coat, and for going to Sunday school every Sunday, I'd earned a Sunday school pin. And I had a pair of my Sunday school gloves. And we had a good view of our house. And my dad was out there jumping up and down and doing this, and I could still see his white sleeves.
After leaving the Pribilofs, the Delaroff picked up 83 more Aleuts from the village of Atka in the Aleutian Islands.
The boat was really crowded. So you line up, and it takes about an hour to get where you're going, look like going up the steps and so on.
The aging transport ship had a capacity of 376 passengers. Now the ship's company numbered 570 men, women, and children. Illness spread rapidly, but the government doctor on board refused to enter the Delaroff's hold, where the Aleut lay sick and dying.
And then this lady that was having a baby wanted a doctor, and she asked around, and his husband asked around to see if they could check on the baby. And they never did, and that poor little baby died. The priest was on there, and he used holy water and named the baby.
Holy God, Holy Mighty, Holy Immortal, have mercy.
And then later on, they wrapped her up in canvas, and they just slid her overboard, her little body.
Glory to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.
That was our first casualty we had.
Now and ever unto the ages of ages, amen.
"4 o'clock in the morning, my mom wake us up. Girls, she said, there's trees. We never see trees before. Oh, we got so excited. 4 o'clock in the morning, we got up to see the trees. But we didn't know we were going to be tired of them for 2.5 years.
This was a strange new land, unlike the treeless, windswept world the Aleuts called home. But as the Delaroff put in at Funter Bay on June 24, 1942, the Aleuts looked with relief on the densely forested landscape of southeast Alaska.
Being so young, I didn't know what was going on. Where other people were worried about being taken off the island, in a way I was happy because, I didn't realize there was a war going on. And when we got to Funter Bay, I saw my very first tree, I thought there was no other place except St. Paul when I was a kid. I really did. I just thought, this is it.
It was myself and the other boys. When we first got here, the first thing we saw was a frog. By golly, we went hunting for a frog. We never knew what that was, so I got one. I came home all muddy. My mom looked at me and said, "Now, what am I going to do with you?" You know.
Shortly after we arrived in Funter Bay, I think the novelty wore off, and we started unloading the ship there. We were all unloaded on the cannery side, the old cannery that had not been operating for several years. The facilities were really deplorable.
Hidden by the tall, fragrant spruce was a terrible reality. The deadly conditions on the ship were more than matched by the conditions on shore.
If you think any of this is fun, you should be here. The water system cannot under any condition be made usable for winter. The outdoor privies empty into the water at high tide, but the sewage still washes back out of the beach for the children to track around. All houses are gone from rot.
A long-abandoned fish cannery and crumbling gold mining camp offered the only shelter.
There were no toilets, no washrooms, no partitions between the rooms that we were put in. For privacy's sake, they put up some blankets between one family and another. Where a lot of us young people, I think there were about a dozen of us, ended up in a attic of a warehouse. I don't even remember how we slept that night, but it's probably on the floor somewhere.
And that night, I saw the elder women crying, and I hide away and cry, and I just feel hurt. My little babies, you know, they were crying, and I said, how are we going to live here? Everybody asked each other, how are we going to live here?
They would live, but barely, sustained only by their powerful faith and will to survive.
I lost my mom. Losing a mother is a traumatic time. It is more traumatic, I think, if you are in strange surroundings. Some years later, I became the head of that agency that was responsible for Aleuts during that evacuation period. I used to reflect on the charge of my predecessors during the war years, and while I was not faced with the magnitude of problems that they were faced with, the inattention that was paid to the living conditions of those evacuees, I think, is criminal.
The 479 Pribilovians at Funter Bay represented more than 1/2 of all Aleut evacuees.
Technically, we were not internees, but neither were we free to leave the camps. I think some people in government believed we needed to be confined for our own good.
They'll get into all kinds of scrapes, drunk. They'll be robbed, fleeced in bunco games, and the first thing, some government office will be getting calls.
There were others. They wanted to keep us in the camps so that it would be easy to round us up to take us back to the islands for seal harvesting.
It is our desire to keep the Native organization as intact as possible. No individual should be permitted to take his family and leave camp. If he insists on doing so, he should lose all rights and should not be allowed to return to the islands. SEAL Division Superintendent Edward C. Johnston.
We were treated a little better than animals, you know, for service to the government.
Officials hadn't found the time to plan for the Aleuts' relocation, but they did find time to organize a press tour.
Never before had any ship brought such a strange cargo to American shores. Lining the rails of the big transport, towering over our little craft, were hundreds of Aborigines, men, women, and children, especially children from the North Pacific and Bering Sea outposts of the Empire.
Reporter Joseph Driscoll of the New York Herald Tribune looked on as the last of the Delaroff's passengers, 83 evacuees from Atka, were loaded onto a fish scow to be taken to Killisnoo, an abandoned whaling village about 50 miles south.
Shepherding the natives were 2 white teachers who had been evacuated with them. As the native children lined up in the fish-stinking scow, they sang "God Bless America" to the tune of Irving Berlin. Somehow, it was rather touching to hear the little Aborigines singing their heads off before breakfast to prove that they were just as patriotic and just as Rotarian as the rest of us. I must say these little yellow-skinned barbarians were much better mannered than many children back home.
When we first got here, it felt good because we had been on the boat for so long, and to breathe the fresh air, smell the trees and the roses. I didn't know at that time that eventually I would not like the trees, but it was nice to be ashore. And we saw this kind of an open field, so the kids were running. All of a sudden they were saying, ouch, ouch. Here we ran into nettles and we didn't know what they were. Left blisters on our legs, you know.
The Atkins arrived at Killisnoo equipped with the accumulated knowledge of 9,000 years of survival. But this environment was completely alien.
We were kind of lost because back home we had routine. There were certain things we had to do to survive. Here they kind of dumped us. Nobody told us what we needed to do. I mean, we knew we had to do something, but what?
The last of the evacuees from the villages of Unalaska, Akutan, Nikolsky, Kashiga, Makushin, and Bjorka arrived in southeast Alaska later that summer. Taken to Wrangell Institute, a boarding school for native children, villagers were quartered in wooden-floored tents. Doctors inoculated the Aleuts against typhoid and smallpox, but other medical measures were tainted by racism. Assuming Aleuts were of low moral character, government doctors required all females 12 years of age and older to undergo physical examinations for venereal disease.
I remember, in particular, the urgency of once we got there, they had to give us all medical treatment of some kind. And my sister, again, being in a certain age group, she was subjected to physical examinations that were so degrading to her. And we felt really bad about that, but we had no say in the matter.
From Wrangell, the Aleuts were moved to more isolated camps.
Houses were in pretty bad shape, very bad shape. And they put a whole bunch in the bunkhouse, and that was not good. Families and all, just not good. We had to rebuild, they supplied the lumber, and we put houses together, built a church, built a school, built some boardwalks, repaired everything.
The elders just did the best they could. Of course, my mom, she was one of the ones in charge. She was one of these people that everybody looked up to her. She took care of medical problems, like broken bones and sewed up wounds and delivered all babies in town, all by herself. I don't know where she got that strength from, but she sure had it.
A handful of evacuees were lost in the system. George Gadeoff, a 15-year-old orphan boy from Kashiga, a tiny Aleutian village, was left to fend for himself.
Yeah, it was kind of weird. I felt like I was separated, but it was kind of strange. I know I had to work, support myself, and best I can. So I worked in Juneau till I joined the service And then I was kind of lost track of everybody after that because I was moved from place to place. You look back on it, you know, it really hurt a lot of people. I mean, taking people away from their environment and their homes, such as they were, such as they had, and to take to a strange place and strange people and ordered around like they were, you know, dogs or something. I mean, you know, it's just, no, that time never thought too much of it, you know, but now you think about it, you know, they could have done a lot better, I think.
In fact, America was doing better for its prisoners of war. Just 22 miles northwest of Thunder Bay at a place called Excursion Inlet, 700 Nazi prisoners of war were eating regular meals, sleeping in warm beds, and receiving regular medical care. Protected by the Geneva Conventions, the prisoners' living standards were much higher than the Aleuts.
Well, it made you feel like you were nothing. I mean, we didn't do anything wrong, and yet we were treated like that. It was hard to understand.
I'm sure everybody thought with the amount of supplies and clothes we were allowed to take that we'd only be gone a few days at the most. And then pretty soon it was weeks, and then months, and then years. Nobody ever knew from day to day how much longer we'd be there. And then people started getting sick. People were getting boils. They were running rampant through the camp. And then we had eye infections. We had impetigo. It was just one thing that was so contagious. We had hair lice that was just rampant. TB was another big problem. We lost several people to TB, tuberculosis.
We lost lots of elders. I think that's why our culture just stood still for a long time. I think that the poor people from Thunder Bay, I think that they suffered the most. The things that they went through were really terrible.
Pribilof Evacuation Camp, Thunder, Alaska, October 7, 1942. I wish to submit my resignation as agent and caretaker. I feel I cannot stay and watch a people I have grown attached to. Only a miracle can prevent a tragedy of sickness and extreme suffering to them.
I don't know how the family survived that summer. Some people were sick. They really belonged in a hospital, like my sister and grandmother.
So we all got together and had a meeting, and then we wrote this letter. I'll read it. We, the people of this place, wants a better place than this to live. This place is no place for a living creature. We drink impure water and then get sick. The children get skin disease, even the grown-ups.
Evacuees' protests were echoed by Territorial Attorney General Henry Roden.
I have no language at my command which can adequately describe what I saw. If I had, I'm confident you would not believe my statements. In short, the situation is shocking. I have seen some pretty tough places in my days in Alaska, but nothing to equal the situation at Thunder.
Why they not take us to a better place to live and work for ourselves? Do we have to see our children suffer? We all have rights to speak for ourselves.
Federal officials responding from their warm offices in the lower 48 states refused the appeal.
Let them know we are all called upon to make sacrifices in connection with the war program. Ward T. Bauer, Director of Alaska Fisheries.
With little help, Aleuts worked to improve the camps, but all their labors could not protect them from destitution, disease, and death. During the years 1942 and 1943, 1 in 10 Aleut evacuees would die. a death rate comparable to that of American soldiers in foreign prisoner of war camps. Like the fine, cold mist filtering through the rainforest, grief settled on the camps, chilling the Aleuts to their very core.
During the evening, there's no heat. There's no heat in the house at all. There 3, 4 of us kids got together and slept in one bed with, if you're lucky, you had a blanket, one army blanket that covered you up. And if you're lucky, you had a slice of bread and a cup of hot water with sugar in it. Even when I was cold, I used to run over to my uncle's, and then he was sick with TB. His name was Blas Pankow. He's the one that raised me on St. Paul, actually, and then so I used to run over in the morning, make sure I could light the stove for him and get him warm, and then fix him a cup of tea. And he'd tell me some stories, believe in God and do this with God on your side, and he was a religious man, so I enjoyed his life.
Blas Pankow was buried on a moldering hillock beneath a dense canopy of spruce and fir. The ground so wet, water filled the grave before his body could be laid to rest. The Aleuts put up crosses and built a fence around the cemetery. Then they made a marker out of twigs, pointing the way to the Pribilof Islands. The twigs represented deprivation and death, but the sign itself was one of faith and hope. The Aleuts, ever determined, would one day go home.
There was a priest on the mine site, so every 2 weeks, if the weather is good, he used to come and have a service. They had fixed up a tent as a temporary church. And he used to talk to us. He said, this won't last forever. God has a lot of love and he will help us. He said, one of these days help will be coming, and just pray that it will come soon. Otče nas is i na nebesie, da světiča imię Twoje, da przyjdzie carstwo Twoje. Please, God, help us.
Before World War II, most Aleuts had never been away from their islands, but they knew America offered more than this.
That was my mother's vision of a dream home. She had a nice yard in front and swimming pool, and she liked the spaciousness of the house itself. That was tragic, to end up in a place like Thunder Bay. Yeah. There are no dream homes there.
News about life in the camps was being carefully censored under the First War Powers Act, but complaints were finally beginning to circulate outside the camps.
Doctors and nurses and newspaper journalists and others were visiting these camps, and they said, what's going on here? For one thing, the draft board wanted to register the Aleuts. The United States Employment Service wanted to employ them in Juneau and places because there was a labor shortage. At first, the agents resisted it, but then they couldn't carry it. They couldn't carry it off. We were fighting a war against fascism.
A conference was called in Washington, D.C. to discuss the Aleut problem. Government lawyers concluded the Department of Interior had no legal authority to confine the Aleuts.
They weren't afraid anymore. They just go.
Yeah, they moved from Thunder Bay to Juneau.
I was 15 when I got my first job in Juneau. Was in Percy's Cafe as a dishwasher. $5 for 1 day. Well, that was good enough. Then they had a fire there after 3 weeks, and I lose my job. It all closed up. Then I looked into the newspaper, and they wanted somebody to work in the governor's house. I got my job there.
The ones that weren't drafted start going to Juneau. After they work 2 weeks or so, they sent for their family. And I was just kind of upset because here my husband is, I don't know where he was. He can't do that to me. He's in service. And I had no choice. I had to stay there. I was going to have my third child.
It was a big educational process that took place from there on. People learned that really they weren't being treated as full citizens.
The U.S. Interior Department, which had administered the Pribilof Islands like a virtual prison colony for 80 years, wasn't about to give up control. In 1941, the year before the Aleut evacuation, the annual seal slaughter delivered $2.4 million to the U.S. Treasury. In 1942, the year of the evacuation, the operation lost $1 million. Now the Interior Department wanted to make up its losses. Problem was, the Aleuts didn't want to go. The SEALs were in a combat zone, and an entire summer of sealing wouldn't amount to a month's wages in their newfound jobs.
The people who were working in Juneau were told that if you don't go, we won't take you back on the Pribilofs. You'll lose the house that we were allowing you to live in. If you don't come and work with us during the summer, we'll just disown you.
The sealing gang finally assembled included 116 evacuees and 12 Aleuts on active military duty, furloughed for the seal harvest.
Pribilof Evacuation Camp, Funter, Alaska, Thursday, May 6th. As we drew away from the dock, a choir of native voices began a farewell chant in Russian, which was answered by those remaining on shore. Many of the women were crying their farewells, never having experienced the parting with their loved ones. It was a sight not soon to be forgotten.
Sealing resumed in the Pribilofs on June 10, 1943, with phenomenal success.
I remember the largest kill that ever was made up there was over 5,800 some odd on St. Paul Island. And I got 153 out of that bunch.
Times 3 cents or 5 cents, huh?
Yeah. Nickel piece. I think it is the hardest work imaginable.
Commercial sealing in the Pribilofs ended in 1984. Pressure from wildlife conservation groups and declining consumer demand shut down the washroom and the salt house. But in 1943, the U.S. sealing operation was unrivaled.
Pretend it's skin. Take the skin and put it right here like that. Take your rubbering knife. Okay, everybody start rubbering. And then you turn it over. Put it up a little and start from middle and all the way down. Everybody was tired, sweating. You would see the road from right here to over there, just steaming like people sweating out.
We went out early in the morning. We took pride in what we did, you know, and there was people assigned to different tasks out there. I was assigned when I first started to be a watchman. I watched the big herd of seals that were rounded up.
An experienced crew could stun, kill, and skin a seal in little more than a minute. Federal agents supervised the Aleuts in partnership with the employees of the Falk Fur Company of Missouri, which acted as a wholesaler of the seal skins.
The government and the Falk Fur Company, they balance, you know. They talk to each other and stuff like that. You know. They have respect for the agent up here, you know, something like that.
He was a pretty hard man to talk to. He used to be out there with it because he's an agent. If you make a little mistake in what you're doing, boy, that guy used to just jump on us.
Well, there was a lot of, you know, talk between the blubbers. They talked to each other and make tease each other and, about how many skins they were getting. And
some of those temporary men, they were from the Aleutian Islands. Well, sometime I used to talk to them in Aleuts and say, hey, I want to
you got all the small skins and I'm getting all the big skins. The tough ones were the big ones. They were very stringy.
That summer saw an all-time record harvest. Some 125,000 skins taken. The agents were jubilant, but reluctantly paid the Aleut sealers.
My share from here, from a sealing division, for the summer was $45. 45 bucks. I made that in 2 weeks at the dishwasher in British Cafe.
Just like slaves, They use us just like slaves.
Worse for the men, a deadly epidemic of influenza was sweeping the camps. Their families were suffering. The unceasing toll of disease and death was recorded in official camp logs.
Thursday, July 8th. St. George evacuation camp. Every man except the cook, the priest, and I have the flu. Monday, July 12th. Still having the flu. Friday, July 16th, about 5 a.m. Alexandra, the wife of Isidore Nestorov, died. One man helped build a casket. 2 men dug a grave.
My mom had our little Sergei, baby Sergei, we call him. And he was 3 months old when he got double pneumonia. And there was the government nurse there, sent him back home with my mom, saying nothing they could do for him. So my mom took him to the midwives. She told him to keep him warm, but where we lived, they only had a 55-gallon drum to warm up something like a 40 by 80 cannery. My mom and the midwives tried their best to get him healthy, but they couldn't. And he just cried, and he died in my mom's arms, And they went and got the priest. The priest came over and gave a blessing to the child, and next day the carpenters were down at the shop making a little coffin for him, and then those were the hardest childhood days we had.
Evacuees from the Pribilofs returned home in the spring of 1944.
We were so happy. We were just crying and we were so happy to be back.
I had lost my mom the year before, so I was going back with my grandfather, and I remember the great excitement, the anxiousness and expectation.
I was only 14 and I was really happy to come back home.
First thing we had here after we got back, my dad went out and got a seal, and then we had seal meat for dinner that evening, which was good. It was home again for all of us.
Evacuees from the Aleutians returned home in 1945, nearly a full year after the Japanese had been vanquished from the islands.
Well, it was a very happy time first, just to get home. We stopped on top of that hill up there and looked down and saw the church, and our whole life revolved around that church before the war, our whole family. It was just like a dream. I mean, it was Is this really happening?
But home was not as they'd left it. The U.S. military had billeted troops in native homes. Army and Navy inspectors confirmed what was obvious to the eye.
Ransacked, doors and windows broken, and it just was terrible. We had no furniture. The BIA bought a few little pieces of, wasn't hardly anything at all, just cheap old. And here they were dismantling the base, and they were taking furniture up to the dump, rugs, beautiful furniture, and burning them.
Even their churches had been vandalized. Centuries-old religious icons had been damaged, destroyed, or stolen.
Tragic. Just tragic. And what happened here on our own continent, in this very place, is a tragedy.
After all the Aleuts had endured, this was devastating.
It's just a waste of time. We lost so much.
Like the patterns woven into the Aleuts' fine grass baskets, their experiences would be woven into their culture. So too the loss of 4 Aleutian villages, Attu, Biorka, Makushan, and Kashiga. Deciding it would be too costly to repatriate the villagers, U.S. authorities declared their homes off limits forever.
I guess you might say I was homeless. I didn't know where to go. My parents were all gone and had a few cousins, and it was a hard decision for me, and I guess I took a plunge, or whatever you want to call it, to face the world.
The world had changed, and so had the Aleuts.
Little by little, the men start having secret meetings in their homes. They didn't want what they're talking about to leak out to the government.
They learned from being in Juneau, being in the armed forces, and having seen how other people live, other places, they began to realize that they were losing out on a lot of things. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of movement. And I think it was those kinds of freedoms that the Aleut people decided they better do something about.
They have to become the agency of their own mattering. In a very real sense, the World War II experience gives them a reference point, a negative, declined reference point from which to step forward.
In 1951, Aleuts from the Pribilof Islands filed a precedent-setting claim against the United States government for gross mistreatment between the years 1870 and 1946. The Aleut independence movement had begun.
The Justice Department contacted me to write a report that they needed in response to the Pribilof Aleuts' suit against the government for 100 years of servitude. What I learned was shocking. I had access to the confidential files that spanned 100 years in the Federal Archives. I had heard things, but I didn't know the extent of the enslavement and oppression of the Aleut people. The government agents were police, they were investigators, they acted as prosecutors and judge and jury. They had totalitarian authority.
I think one of the important things was to be treated as bona fide American citizens. I think that's where the idea of citizenship came up, and the fact that they weren't given any opportunities to vote. And it really went into blowing up affair when Carl Moses, who was running for the state legislature, came to St. Paul Island, and the agent that was there on the island then wouldn't let him off the airplane. That was 1964. I was astounded. And apparently he knew I was coming because he picked me out of the group and came over and told me that I couldn't stay. I'd have to get back on the plane. It got national attention, the fact that a politician was refused entry into a local precinct. But that was the last time that would ever happen.
The Aleuts' lawsuit against the U.S. government was providing a more difficult challenge.
The case took a long time. Although it started back in 1951, it wasn't settled until, I think, 1978. But even then, the distribution that was made based on treatment, ill treatment, and deprivation of civil rights and so forth didn't amount to very much.
We have a tendency to forget, although we're reminded now more often than we used to be, that we've never been without a race problem in American history. The change that the Aleut people have made is really quite remarkable.
Aleuts were making incredible gains, but the World War II experience continued to haunt them.
My oldest daughter, Patricia, was about 15 years old, and I was telling her about her Aleut family and etc. And I told her that one time the U.S. Navy burnt our village and evacuated us, and told her about how hard the life was in Killisnoo. She looked at me and says, "Mama, are you sure?" And says, "It happened?" I said, "Yes, it happened." He says, "But it's not in history books." She didn't believe that it actually happened. We almost lost our culture. It came to a halt. Although it wasn't our fault, it made you feel that you had something to be ashamed of.
The nature of injustice is such that it is not quantified by the numbers of people who are affected, in my view. Injustice is something that happens to individuals. Individuals suffer injustice, perhaps groups of individuals, but they are individuals. I think that our society recognizes that individuals matter.
Attorney John Kirkland took up the Aleuts' cause in 1978.
This is vandalism by U.S. forces. So we're recommending that compensation, a lump sum amount, be
Retained by the Aleutian Pribilof Islands Association, he would prove an effective ally in a historic campaign to seek reparations from the U.S. government.
be used to rehabilitate churches and church properties from the maintenance of Aleut cemeteries remote from the villages, such as Funter Bay.
We went through literally thousands of documents in scores of boxes, just focused on this period. Letters, logs, Western Union telegrams, minutes of meetings that established fundamentally the case for the Aleut people to show the injustices that they had suffered.
A decorated military veteran, Kirtland shared the Aleuts' view that America could have done better.
In many ways, there was a humanitarian impulse for the removal of the Aleuts, but there was an abysmal bureaucratic failure in terms of the duty to care for the Aleuts once they had been removed from their homes and relocated to these camps. We don't have, I don't believe, an absolutely accurate enumeration of those who passed away. But we do know that at least 10% died while they were in the camps in the government's care. That mortality rate was shocking.
Japanese Americans interned during World War II were already lobbying Congress for reparations. An alliance was formed between the two, affording both groups greater political influence. But the Aleuts, still invisible to their nation, would have to make their own case.
It was completely different from the Japanese-American experience in the internment camps in World War II. There was no question in anyone's mind about the loyalty of the Aleuts.
In Washington and across the nation, the attitude was conciliatory. No question World War II had been an epic struggle for good, but Vietnam and Watergate had taught that governments make mistakes.
So, President Carter, on July the 31st, 1980, signed into law a bill which established the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, with two principal mandates: to consider the claims of the Japanese Americans and to consider the claims of the Aleut people. And so the process began.
From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News with Dan Rather.
Tens of thousands of them were sent to concentration camps, in the words of...
News around the globe focused on the Japanese-American internment. The Aleut story was a mere footnote, but that hardly mattered. For the first time in U.S. history, Aleuts had a place on the nation's political agenda.
Now, some 40 years after the fact, a federal commission is investigating that dark chapter in the nation's past to seek appropriate remedies.
Today we open our hearings first with concern about the Aleuts.
One of the real leaders in this cause was Philemon Tudiakov.
Yes, thank you for your welcome.
He was a wonderful little man, and yet he was a towering giant of a person. He was effective, he was articulate, and he spoke from the heart.
All right, so U.S. citizens will take the phone.
We had compelling Aleut witnesses that appeared before this very distinguished commission.
Food was hard to come by all during the time you were there. And Mr. Shishnikov says, I don't know how I made it.
And we had the depositions of scores of more of them. And all of this effort caused the commission to recommend back to the Congress, restitution for both the Aleuts and the Japanese Americans.
The commission concluded that the United States had failed its citizens. The government's failure to care was directly responsible for widespread disease and death in the camps and the loss of community and personal property in the Aleuts' villages. The government had, as a matter of simple convenience, limited the Aleuts' personal freedoms, treating them as a herd of animals.
I think that one thing one takes away from this is it's very important to respect the dignity of individuals and to give people the authority to be in charge of their own lives. And I hope that is a core value of this country. And that made what happened in the Second World War to both these groups of individuals important to remember and to learn from.
In the camps, Aleuts' protests had fallen on deaf ears. The commission's report gave them a voice, and Alaska's lawmakers, closely aligned with Japanese-American leaders, would provide the political muscle for the coming debate on Capitol Hill.
No one other than the Japanese or Alaska Natives were actually taken from their lives and interned and treated as though they were aliens. Other Americans that were moved out of harm's way were not interned. And they were put on islands. They had no ability to leave. They had no ability to work. And they were really totally left in isolation during the period of the war. So I thought they should be compensated, as well as those who were interned as Japanese. We were seeking just simple justice, that's all.
Between 1983 and 1988, 7 different redress measures were introduced in Congress.
Which the clerk will report by title.
Bill to implement the recommendations of the Commission on the Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians.
My father instilled in me the injustice of what we did to the Japanese, and that extended to the Aleuts.
That were actually used as slave laborers by the United States government.
It was a very emotional thing for me because it's probably one of the unjust things that have happened during our civilization.
Mr. Rodino is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, today as we celebrate the signing of our Constitution 200 years ago, we have an opportunity to reaffirm that this great document of human liberty applies to all Americans.
We are going to admit that we made a mistake. And I think it is part of a great nation to be able to admit that we made a mistake.
Governments do things wrong, and only democracies have the ability to right those wrongs.
On August 10, 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed Public Law 100-383. The long battle for redress had been won.
This was truly a tremendous achievement. The new law provided for a $5 million trust fund for the benefit of the villagers who had been returned and their descendants. It also provided $1.4 million for restoration of church properties, $15 million for the loss of Attu Island, and individual payments of $12,000 to those Aleuts who had survived the camps and were still alive at the time the public law became effective.
Thank you all again, and God bless you all. I think this is a fine day.
No amount of money can restore priceless icons that were lost from the churches, or the loss of a loved one due to neglect and disease. No amount of money can compensate for the loss of a traditional village site on Attu. But it's necessary sometimes to compensate a people for injustices by helping the next generation and the generation thereafter, generations that have been set back by the losses. We have to remember that our country is going to suffer calamities, threats, attacks by foreign enemies. But in the course of these events, we must ensure that the liberties of our individual citizens are not shunted aside in some misguided effort to protect the greater good. The experience of the Aleuts is significant. It's just a few people. It's just a few people, but many of their fundamental rights were ignored or shunted aside in the course of World War II, and we cannot allow the same thing to happen to others today.
When we got back from Thunder Bay, my mom used to be so quiet. She'd come here and sit in this chair I'm sitting in now and looking out and looking at the cemetery. So one day I asked her, Mom, you're so quiet because you're missing Grandma, huh? You're looking at the cemetery every day. And she said, yeah. And I said, well, maybe someday, some years, we'll go back and visit Grandma again, and baby Sergei and Uncle Vlas Pankov and the rest of the people that we left behind.
Oh, look at that boat.
After nearly 60 years, that day has come. A distance of some 1,500 miles separates the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands from Thunder Bay. But the distance this group will travel is more rightly measured in memories than miles.
I was a young man, you know, I was only 15 years old when we came here. It was tough. And the mountain that you see in the background there, several of us went up to the top of that mountain, stayed overnight to hunt for deer. And we came back with 6 deer and fed the people with venison stew. That was great. I mean, I enjoyed that very much. That was an experience of my life.
Returning is hard, but a lifetime of achievements have given them insight. Individuals are not defined by what is done to them, but rather by the choices they make. Jake became a two-star general in the U.S. Army, one of only a few Native Americans to achieve that rank.
I'd like to welcome you to Thunder Bay,
Thank
General
you very
Jake.
much. It's a very beautiful bay indeed.
Yes, sir. Yeah,
It wasn't some years ago,
You'll
was
be
it?
here for 2 years now.
Okay.
Florey became an influential business and political leader. Mary is widely respected as a keeper of Aleut traditions. And Vlas served in the U.S. Marine Corps and then the Alaska State Troopers. Peter Bordakovsky, the third child of Mary and George Bordakovsky, was born at the camp. Most of the old cannery has rotted away. What remains are memories.
This is the cabin my friend George and Efrosinia Rukovisnikov used to stay. She used to have candy. They're from Imperial Candy Company, Seattle, USA. And she said her husband went to Juneau for medical reason and brought this big can of hard candies for her and her children. So this brings me a lot of memories. Yes.
Tunulang kayo kung St. Paul and Nietzsche saw wow ne. Dan wil wat kunnen.
Kadang na miya kasaw na singwali tanetrik.
Aha. Ja, ja, in balans Penko Church we know what I'm saw. I'm to William Mosque na TB Land Mosque.
I'm looking for my father-in-law's grave. His name is Peter Bordakovsky.
Blas Penko some place around here.
Got some flowers for him. Peter Bordakovsky. Oh, he's right over there.
Oh, this is in memory of my grandmother, Pelagay Lakanov. She died here summer of 1943. There we go.
To the prayer of his all pure mother, holy virgin, laudable apostle, and of all the holy God-bearing fathers, and of all the saints, establish the souls of the servant of God, all those who lost their lives during the World War II encampment, who have been taken from us, and the man's of righteous, give them rest in Abraham's bosom, number them among the just, have mercy on us and on, for as much as he is good and loveth mankind. Amen. Siate bozit, siate krepte, siate besmerne paviloina.
After 60 years, I finally getting to clean this stone. Great grandma, this woman here. WW2, she passed on after she broke her leg on one of those plank roads we had here, plank walkways. I can say that why was the biggest question as we got here the first time. I know why now. I mean, oh, that's a little better, isn't it?
World War II was a traumatic experience for Aleut people. They have lived with that experience and those memories for a long time. And now is the time to rebuild and replace some of those things that were lost.
Today, 6 Russian Orthodox churches in the Aleutian and Pribilof Islands are being carefully rebuilt.
You're tuned into listener-supported KUHB St. Paul 91.9 FM. It's time for the Pribilof postcard for Friday, June 9th, 2000. The Russian Orthodox Church is being restored this summer. If you can help remove and store the church icons, or if you'd like to help with the
This is my first restoration project. I've never done anything like this before. You got to put a lot of heart and effort into your work since this is the church and almost everybody in the community comes here to pray, so I mean, it's got to be a good job.
Symbolically, the last nail in St. Paul Church closes the World War II chapter of the Aleut history.
My father and my grandfather and people of that generation, their history has given us energy that we could use for our time, but at the same time, we can't carry some of the burdens of it with us. We didn't go through the internment. We are not slaves of the harvest. Those days are gone.
O Master Lord our God, hearken to the prayer which I now address unto thee, and bless this cross.
We have an opportunity to restore ourselves and our purpose here.
And ever unto ages of ages, amen.
Much more than a physical act, the historic restoration of these churches symbolizes the resurrection of a people.
Restoring the spirit, restoring the soul, and restoring the culture of the Aleut people, and will go on forever.
This program was funded in part by the Aleutian Pribilofs Islands Restitution Trust, the Rasmussen Foundation, the Paul G. Allen Family Foundation, and by
Hello, my name is Sybil Ward. I'm coming out in support of the LGBTQ community because people that I love have been brave enough to come out to me, including my most extraordinary sister, Deborah. When she came out to me, I became a better, braver person. So please don't be silent in the face of bullying. Be brave. Let's make our schools a safe place for all of our students.
Hi, my name is Maria Thorpe. I work for the Facility Services Division at LA Unified School District. I'm coming out as gay today to be a role model to students, to show other faculty and staff that we can be out and be role models to children. This is very important to me because I have 2 young boys and I want them to feel safe and to be who they are.
Who are you coming out for? For more information, visit the following websites.
Next time on Masterpiece Classic.
I do not think that is a wise move.
Value your position here and you shall alter the way you speak to me.
We have to keep moving forward, keep evolving. Tollgate Street Traders. Competitively priced, tradition and quality.
I need you to know that you are my inspiration. You must stop this. You cannot have everything your way.
Next time on Masterpiece Classic.
Up next,